All right, I think things are getting settled down. Welcome, everybody. I'm Starsha Gill. I do events here at the Program in Creative Writing. I'm happy to introduce Shane McCrae, who is doing a lecture for our Poem Present series. Normally, Suzanne Buffum would have been here, but she is delayed. I'm just going to kind of let Shane take the stage and give his lecture, and we can take questions after the lecture in the Q&A box. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Starsha, for that introduction. This is going to be a pretty short lecture. I think even though we're however many years into it, we're still trying to figure out how much Zoom people can stand. Gratefully, I won't be going on for ever. I'm just going to make a few little points. So I'll just get started. I thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Very responsibly, Starsha asked me maybe a month ago, maybe longer, if I had a title for the lecture, and I had to reply that I did not. The reason for that is because I don't ever have any ideas. And so having to come up with a title for a lecture it's just not something I, as of yet, at this point in my life, have ever managed to do before I've more or less written the lecture, which never happens until I am incredibly panicked and feel like there's no way I could possibly get it done. And that's when I can finally start to think. The title of this lecture is The Old Line, Blank Verse in Matthew Buckley Smith's Aegon Dart, which is a poem you might not have read, but that's okay. I'm going to read it to you. And it's a poem I've been sort of obsessed with for some months now. So let me share my screen here so you can see it, and then I will get to actually talking. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So Matthew Buckley Smith makes a possibly notorious podcast called Slee Rickets. Slee Rickets is notorious, if it's notorious, because MBS, he also has notorious initials, I'll call him Smith from now on, critiques poems and poets honestly. Though I don't want to suggest by my use of the word honestly that his honesty is absolute, but only that he doesn't water down his opinions. I disagree with many of his opinions, and I've told him so, but I value his honesty. And of course, I'm hedging about whether Slee Rickets is notorious because I don't know how many people in the poetry world know it exists. A quick perusal of Twitter, yes, I just stopped writing this lecture to check Twitter, suggests Slee Rickets hasn't yet become a top subject of conversation in the poetry world, though of course that doesn't mean people aren't listening. Smith, as far as I can tell, feels comfortable critiquing significant people in the poetry world honestly, because he believes he doesn't have anything as far as the poetry world is concerned to lose. And although he hasn't said so, I suspect he believes he doesn't have anything to lose as far as the poetry world is concerned, because his own poetry, yes, I just realized I hadn't yet mentioned that Smith is a poet, his own poetry is written utilizing rhyme and meter in traditional ways. With regard to their meters and forms, his poems could have been written, say, 100 years ago. Edwin Arlington Robinson is the 20th century poet whose work Smith's most resembles, though the 20th century predecessor to whom Smith owes the most, regardless of whether this particular poet directly influenced Smith, is Ivor Winters. Or his poems could have been written 400 years ago, whereas considered from the perspective of a reader of English language poetry 500 years ago, his meter would seem strangely regular. That great regularizer, Philip Sidney, wouldn't write his works for another 70 years. Smith's poems, considered metrically, do not read as if they were most likely written today. He uses an old line. A poet's line is a proxy for the poet's relationship to the history of the art, but a proxy not for the kind of relationship, but for the degree to which that relationship is troubled. A new line indicates only a single private break, a break which is always incomplete, with the poetry that has come before it, and may be immediately imitated by those who recognize it as a break, but would wish to originate no such break themselves, as well as by those who consider it an extension of the poetry that came before it, rather than a break therewith, and most obviously by those who recognize the new line as a break and are excited about, or at least agitated by, the break and the new developments that might emerge from the fissure. The originator of the new line is in a more dramatic lover's quarrel with the poetry of the past than is the poet who is happy to use an inherited line. But every poet is in a lover's quarrel with the poetry of the past, and only in the least interesting poem will this quarrel be the most important aspect of the poem. Smith's line suggests his lover's quarrel is a very mild one. This, it seems to me, is all to the good. We can talk about his line in terms of what it is itself doing, because we don't need to talk about how it contrasts with other examples of blank verse in the tradition of which it is a part. Let's consider a mid-length monologue from Smith's forthcoming second book, Midlife. This is Aegon Dart. Here in the studio, everything has its place, and every man his tools and given task. I am the one that makes the Aegon Dart. Outsiders seldom recognize the term. It names the trim on certain walls and columns, sometimes around the edge of a relief that alternates an oval with a bar, forever in a perfect marble band, the excellence of which is not being seen. You have not seen it many times before. Next time, perhaps, you will not think of me, the nobody who gives this nothing shape, the oldest in our studio by far, apart from the old master, just my senior, as in the first days, by a few short years, the length of an apprenticeship for most. The master's own apprenticeship concluded, perhaps too early, with a masterpiece, a seraph in a doorway gazing on a child Madonna shrouded like a crone, her misery suspended by the word the angel brings of joy soon to be born, and soon thereafter fixed upon a cross. The scene was carved from one pink, seamless slab, the maker hardly older than the maid. It is a wonder. Go sometime and see. 4 decades since have not produced the like. Such is my master's failure, justly grand, as mine is justly slight enough to keep within the margins where I've made a life of egg and dart and egg and dart and egg. Sometimes a seraph or a curlicue alters the line, a blossom now and then, brief variations on a constant theme. I make the new boys practice till they weep. For them, I'm yet no different than the master. Another beard, another marble hand. The older ones know better. Egg and dart they loathe and gladly shirk, and cannot think of anything but being soon beyond it. They make good sport of me, the knave of darts, Methuselah, the master's wife, his mother. Each cohort thinks their cleverness the first. Some have, it's true, known something of success. A few have set up workshops of their own, contending for commissions now with us. Dull, churchy tableau mostly, gaudy stuff fit only for the pious and the rich. Not one of them has yet achieved a piece like that with which our master made his name. And none could ever chisel egg and dart more than a pace or two, and those too false. The darts strung loose, no pair of eggs the same. Though some lacked cunning, most lacked only care. And even when I made them watch my hand, shaping a path across the element, none of them saw the knave of darts himself. If any had, he might have seen a man at home within the shadow of a man, content to turn out faultlessly his craft for children's pay and incidental thanks. No wonder they look elsewhere for their dreams. My own, of late, touch on the Blessed Virgin, mantled in pink, just as our master made her, the day he drew the rubble from her face and found her flushed with motherly despair, compelled to carry what she might not keep. I pray that she will guide the master's hand one final time for one last worthy form, a miracle to warm his dying fame, a garment of which I might take the hem. This morning, though, no mysteries are revealed. Fleeing an endless breakfast with the count to play a prince among apprentices, our master has declared, perhaps in jest, that Aegon Dart are meant to signify the figures of a woman and a man, begetting undistinguished generations, one undistinguished coupling at a time. An older boy, restless to show his wit, suggests that Aegon Dart are eye and tongue, perceptive and appetitive in turn, enshackled by a mutual disdain. The quips and quibbles patter on, and not a word I haven't heard before. Now we will lose the morning day to talk of women's tongues and men's relentless eyes. Wine will be brought, a boy will play guitar. No one will think to ask me what I think. For 40 years, I've cut the egg, the dart. I've never known a woman or a man as I have them, not my own eyes and tongue. I know what they are. I know what they're not. If asked, I'd say they are nothing less than stone. So here's a picture of the Aegon Dart, an architectural feature you have almost certainly seen, wait, where is it? And ignored dozens, if not hundreds of times. You can see the thing that looks like the dart and the thing that looks like the egg. There's graffiti on most of the eggs there, but that's what an Aegon Dart looks like. They're everywhere. I didn't notice them until I read this poem, and now I can't stop seeing them. So Smith's speaker in Aegon Dart is a sculptor specializing in the making of that particular feature, and an instructor in a workshop run by a sculptor he calls the master. He seems, at least, to be a proponent of the idea that humble orderliness is necessary to the making of art, and to declare the rule of orderliness in the very first line of the poem. Here in the studio, everything has its place. But is that line itself orderly? Aegon Dart is a blank verse monologue, and so for the most part is written in lines of 5 iambic feet each. I say for the most part, of course, because a good traditionally metrical poet will allow small variations in their line so as to keep their line from becoming stale. The most common variation in the iambic pentameter line being, of course, the Trochaic inversion. That is the substitute of a trochee, a metrical foot consisting of a stressed syllable and an unstressed syllable in that order, for an iamb, a foot consisting of an unstressed syllable and a stressed syllable in that order. Usually trochaic inversions occur at the beginning of a line. This is called an initial trochaic inversion, but they can also occur in the second foot, the third foot, and the fourth foot. And when they do, they are often preceded by a pause usually generated by punctuation. This is called a medial trochaic inversion. Trochaic inversions can also occur in the fifth foot of an iambic pentameter line, but that particular substitution is uncommon. You might have noticed when looking at the line on the page that the first line of Aegon Dart, unlike every other line in the poem, is not iambic pentameter. Rather, it has 6, mostly iambic metrical feet. And so is iambic hexameter, which incidentally is my favorite meter. Substituting a hexameter line for a pentameter line as the first line of a blank verse poem is an unusual thing to do. It is a pointedly unusual thing to do when the line itself, in a blank verse context, a disordered line, declares orderliness. But listen closer to the line as well as to the line following it, which together make the first sentence of the poem. Here in the studio, everything has its place, and every man his tools and given task. You will have noticed that the first line features not 1, but 2 trochaic inversions, an initial trochaic inversion herein, and a medial trochaic inversion, the every at the beginning of everything, which is immediately preceded by a very audible comma. The first line of the poem is, in the context of what follows it, a very irregular line, though as the first utterance of the poem, it establishes its own order, an order that does not outlast its length, an order not governed by the order established by the tradition from which the poem arises, the blank verse tradition, but instead an order that tries and fails to establish its metrical authority over the lines that follow it. And you will have noticed that the blank verse tradition establishes itself heavily, and maybe even a little vengefully, in the second line. And every man his tools and given task. I say the blank verse establishes itself maybe a little vengefully because the very first stress in the line falls on the exact syllable sound that was in the first line, the syllable sound that bore the stress in the second trochaic inversion, the ev in every. The second line wrenches metrical authority from the first and does so with the syllable that, in the first line, because it signals the second Trochaic inversion, might be thought of as confirming the first line's own metrical pattern, which was itself a regular pattern, albeit unusual. Trochai, I am, trochai, I am. The metrical pattern in the first line cannot fight the weight of the blank verse tradition and instead succumbs to it. Very sad, but blank verse is mean streets. As plain and old-fashioned as his line might seem, Smith is a metricist who knows what he is doing. Consider again the subject of the poem, a sculptor who specializes in the making of the Aegon Dart, and who seems to be a proponent of the idea that humble orderliness is necessary to the making of art, speaks of his relationship with art, his students, and a sculptor he calls the master. The speaker refers to himself as a nobody who gives a nothing shape. However, he also says that the master's own apprenticeship concluded perhaps too early, and he prays that the Virgin Mary will guide the master's hand one final time for one last worthy form, a miracle to warm his dying fame, a garment of which I might take the hem. According to the speaker, the master might not, in fact, be worthy of his title. Indeed, the speaker, though he doesn't come out and say so, seems to want to be the master himself. Let me read to you two versions of the same story. The story appears in each of the synoptic gospels, and the versions I'm going to read are taken from the King James Bible because it's the most well-known English language translation of the Bible. As far as many poets are concerned, it might as well be the only English language translation. The first version of the story appears in Matthew chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, if I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. But Jesus turned him about, and when he saw her, he said, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. And the woman was made whole from that hour. The second version appears in Luke chapter 8, verses 43 to 48. And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched the border of his garment. And immediately her issue of blood stanched. And Jesus said, who touched me? When all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee. And sayest thou, who touched me? And Jesus said, somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. And when the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. Recall that the speaker of Aegon Dart prays that the Virgin Mary will guide the master's hand one final time for one last worthy form, a miracle to warm his dying fame, a garment of which I might take the hem. That final line, a garment of which I might take the hem, has much in common with the phrase from Matthew, touched the hem of his garment. But there is a crucial difference in the speaker's choice of verbs. He does not say touch, he says take. When the woman touches Jesus's garment, Jesus perceives that virtue has gone out of him. And let me just note here that the word translated as virtue in the King James Bible is nowadays often translated as power. Touching the hem of Jesus's garment instigates the transfer of effective virtue, also known as power, from Jesus to the woman. Well, the speaker of Aegon Dart doesn't want to just touch the hem of the garment. He wants to take it. He wants the virtue, the power, the mastery to belong to him. But what does that have to do with the poem's meter, which is ostensibly the subject of this lecture? A few minutes ago, I reminded you that the speaker says that the master's own apprenticeship concluded perhaps too early. Recall also that the speaker asserts the master has failed to live up to the promise of the single great work he produced at the beginning of his career. Indeed, the speaker says enough over the course of the poem to suggest he has doubts about the master's fitness to be the master. The world in which and according to which the speaker lives is, at its root, disordered, because the person who is the master of the world might very well not be fit to be the master. But if the master is unfit to be the master, perhaps the speaker, he who wants to take the hem through which power is conveyed, is fit to be the master? Though he doesn't come out and say so, his sense that he ought to be the master guides the particular metrical irregularities of the poem. But I should say metrical irregularity, singular. The unusually prevalent metrical irregularity in Smith's line in Aegon Dart is the Trochaic inversion, a metrical irregularity according to which the order of stresses in a line is reversed, stress being, in English language metrical poetry for the most part, the feature of the language that determines the metrical identity of a given line. That is, the unusually prevalent metrical irregularity both enacts and expresses disorder. It expresses the disorder that is in the world because the master is in charge, but it also introduces disorder as an expression of the speaker's desire to introduce a different kind of disorder by asserting power in the master's studio. The poem isn't dominated by Trochaic inversions, however. The Trochaic inversion is, as I've said, simply unusually prevalent in the poem. Here's some numbers. Of the 94 lines in the poem, 18 of them, or 19.148%, I promised Starsha there would be math and percentages on this, include at least one Trochaic inversion. Compare that to another of Smith's mid-length monologues, Anku, which includes at least one Trochaic inversion in only 6 of 82 lines, or 7.317%. And because you are now enthralled by what I'm saying, and as a consequence, curious to know what's up with Anku, I'll tell you. The unusually prevalent metrical irregularity in Anku is the elision that reduces a 2-syllable word to a 1-syllable word, which occurs 5 times in 82 lines, whereas in Aegon Dart, that particular irregularity occurs only twice in 94 lines. Though Smith, of course, doesn't say this in the poem, I suspect that irregularity is unusually prevalent in Anku because the speaker wants to say as little as possible, and so reduces the 2-syllable words to 1-syllable words because she fears accidentally invoking Anku, who is a deadly supernatural being. Now, where were we? Of course, 18 lines out of 94 is a minority of lines, yes, but I suspect were there many more Trochaic inversions in the poem, its iambic identity would be threatened. A variation requires a backdrop of regularity to signify its variation. One way to conceptualize the Trochaic inversions in this poem is to think of them as the striking of a hammer upon a chisel in an effort to push a sculpture in a new direction. And you can tell, can't you, that I know nothing about sculpting, but hopefully my idiocy is nonetheless evocative. With each inversion, the speaker attempts to assert his own power, to become a disordering force, but the regularity of the iambic rhythm, the rhythm of his daily life, the routine to which he has been accustomed for many years, the regularity of the iambic rhythm always reasserts itself. The final Trochaic inversion occurs in the 3rd line from the end of the poem, near the end of these lonely thoughts. For 40 years I've cut the egg, the dart. I've never known a woman or a man as I have them, not my own eyes and tongue. So to my mind, the not my is a trochee, but I suppose you could argue not my, the my is stressed, but that doesn't sound quite right. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, though he doesn't say so, the speaker seems to find the loneliness of these thoughts unbearable, for in the final 2 lines of the poem, rather than attempting to push the sculpture in a new direction with an additional Trochaic inversion, but also rather than allow the smooth iambic line of his daily routine, the smooth iambic line of the master's authority, which is also, for the purposes of the poem's technical identity, the smooth iambic line of the blank verse tradition. Rather than allow the smooth iambic line to continue, the speaker throws down his tools, and the poem ends with 2 not at all smooth, albeit still pentameter lines. I know what they are, I know what they're not. If asked, I'd say they are nothing less than stones. If one were to scan the penultimate line of the poem according to the dominant speech stresses alone, one would get, I know what they are, I know what they're not. 4 stresses. However, of course, if one were to scan a line with the iambic pattern controlling one's interpretation, one would get, I know what they are, I know what they're not, which is difficult for me to say even when I see it. And that is pentameter, but it's pentameter only if one resists the language. And the last line If asked, I'd say they are nothing less than stone, is a mess. There's a willful extra syllable in the third foot, making the foot an anapest, maybe. An anapest being a three-syllable metrical foot in which two unstressed syllables are followed by a stressed syllable. Making no allowances, the scansion of the line looks like this. If asked, I'd say they are nothing less than stone. Now, according to the rules of elision, we can understand they are as elided down to one syllable, there. And then the line works as iambic pentameter. But in the line just before, Smith showed us he knows how to contract they are for metrical reasons if he wants to. The only conclusion we can come to about that extra syllable in the third foot is that Smith left that bit of metrical awkwardness in the line on purpose. The speaker has thrown down his tools, and if he isn't going to defy the pentameter with his trochees anymore, neither is he going to help the pentameter to run smoothly. In fact, he's going to insist in a weary way that the pentameter doesn't run smoothly, not with the insertion of an extra foot and two trochaic inversions as he did in the first line of the poem. Nothing so flashy, nothing so assertive. He has given up. He simply isn't going to bother eliding the extra syllable out of the line. Again, he has given up. What I have been suggesting, and what I will now say outright, is this. Even in its most minute details, meter is expressive and not only organizational. And this is comprehensible in the broadest way, in the way easiest for people to communicate between each other when we share an understanding of basic facts and ideas according to which meter operates, facts like what iambs and trochees and anapests are, and ideas like the idea that a trochaic inversion in the final foot of an otherwise iambic line is usually a bad move because it tends to sound bad. When we ignore meter, we do not expand our options for expression, we limit them. As far as art is concerned, in the pursuit of freedom, we often make ourselves less free. Though this paradox is frequently encountered in art, it is apparently so profound that no matter how many times we encounter it, we find it impossible to guide our actions according to a functional understanding of it, and we imprison ourselves accordingly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane. And I sincerely apologize for showing up so late. I had an emergency that took a little more time than I hoped. But in any case, I did come in just after I think you finished reading the poem and have been able to track it down online. So I look forward to spending more time with it after. I think I want to jump right to this wonderful question that John Wilkinson, who is our program director and a poet who thinks a great deal about prosody himself, has asked here in the Q&A. He says that this question follows from your reading. Your poetry has largely followed a Wordsworthian prescription of plain language, metrically arranged, attached to a narrative or scenario. But the new long poem you read at the end of last night's reading felt like a new development, a prosodic pleating, where the rhythmic waves felt as though they didn't even have to be in language. They could be danced or painted. Do you recognize this description? And do you anticipate that the Tower poem, the title of which you'll have to remind us, inaugurates a changing idiom in your work?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you, John. I mean, I guess this is a poetry nerd thing. When I saw your name in the list of attendees, my thought, I saw it last night, I thought I saw it today, and my thought each time was like, is that the John Wilkinson? It was very, I was very excited. Okay, so the answer to that question. Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is, I don't know. I think it's a poem in some sense. I mean, I guess all one's poems should be in some sense beyond one. It's a poem that was in some sense beyond me, which is not to say it's some sort of marvelous thing, simply a thing beyond my capacities, which are, limited. But I was attempting to make something that sounded a little bit different. I, um, I think this might be the case for every poet, but I've always wanted to be a more lyrical poet than I am, by which I mean, in a very primitive way, I suppose, that I've always wanted to make poems that are beautiful, but I've not really felt myself very capable of producing something that I at least recognize as beauty, or the kind of beauty that I'm interested in, which tends to be linguistic beauty. I have just, generally speaking, not a lot of ability, but a lot of desire. And so that poem was sort of an attempt to make something sound a little bit more musical, um, at least point in the direction of a beauty that I am not capable of achieving. And it was to some degree a conscious effort to do that. But also, I recognized as it was going along that there was something different about the music, because I guess I was trying to reproduce a kind of, I guess, really very sort of liquid musical effect that I've heard in some other poems. I guess I at the time had been seeing a lot of it in James Merrill, of all people, a poet with regard to whose work I have strongly mixed feelings, but he achieved moments like the moment that I was aiming for, and I think it's also a consequence, that poem, of inserting punctuation into my poems, which has been something that I've done and then moved away from, and wish I could figure out how to move toward again. It changes the way one thinks. It suggests a certain kind of writing. It controls the way a line sounds in a way that I need to sort of achieve a degree of mastery over, like commas, before I can really be comfortable writing poems in that mode more. But in that poem, I think there was a degree of balance between my own compositional motion and the way that punctuation was interacting with it. So I have some other poems that are maybe in some ways similar, and I fantasize that I'll write even more. So maybe it points to a new direction. I would like it to.
And as John notes here, following up, of course, you did achieve what you were setting out to do with that beauty and all of that repetition. Repetition is a device you have used from the beginning, it seems to me, in your poems. In earlier version, thinking back to the book Blood, your earlier poems, the repetition almost felt in that case more like a stammering almost, or a self-interrupting, where your syntax the sentence would be interrupted, and then you'd come back and repeat words and pick them up, and the meaning of this sentence would arrive after rereading the sentence a few times, in my experience, in any case. And it seems like repetition in your later poems is perhaps more of that kind of musical song-like. It plays a more of a song-like role, it seemed to me, especially that last poem that John was pointing out. It's a very open question, but be interested to hear from you how your thoughts about repetition in your poems has evolved, because it seems like it has been a constant but changing technique.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. It arises out of in response to several particular stimuli and in answer to particular needs, or maybe one overriding need. So it probably comes out of my really deep love of repetition in music, which itself emerges from my teenage infatuation with shoegazing music, and in particular My Bloody Valentine's album Loveless, which would get locked into repetitions of phrases and just sort of ride those out for really long stretches, or what seemed to a teenager who had heard nothing like that before, really long stretches. And I realized, loving that music, that I didn't need to do a lot of variations. You can just sort of repeat the same thing, and there's something in that that is itself satisfying and doesn't require repetition with variation. And it also has to do with when I was trying to figure out, determine my idiom, which wasn't in some ways a very organic thing. I mentioned it last night, that it was something that I kind of chose around the writing of my first book. One thing that I wanted, knowing, being very conscious of my sort of meager abilities, if I was going to write metrical verse, I didn't want to have to resort to like syntactical inversions or other goofy things to make my meter and rhyme work. But I knew that I didn't have the degree of competence necessary to, avoid those sorts of things. And so what happened was that instead of, doing those awkward syntactical things, I would, employ repetition a lot, because it allowed me, if I couldn't figure out how to get to the end of a line in the way I wanted, I could just repeat a phrase and kind of start over. And so it was a very practical thing. I thought essentially that I could generate a style that would allow me to use a whole lot of different kinds of crutches, primary amongst these being repetition, without people knowing that that's what I was doing, because the style itself would seem to demand those sorts of moves. And so it, I like repetition a lot. I like how it sounds. It also allows me to not be a very good poet. And so that's kind of where it came from. But it's something I really enjoy, and what I've sort of been struggling with for a little while is this sort of nightmare of competence, where in the most recent work, maybe from the seventh book, or maybe from the sixth book on, I've gotten to a point where I have a sort of passable basic level of ability, and I don't have to rely on the crutches that I made for myself. And it means that I'm losing certain elements in my work that I like a lot, because I don't need those anymore to make a poem. And it is a nightmare because I don't want to lose them. And so you have to figure out, or I have to figure out, new reasons to have them in, reasons that are sort of purely musical, or, as opposed to reasons that had to do with my inability to do anything else. And it is, the nightmare of competence is a nightmare that I think most makers of art, although it feels gross to include myself in that category. But so I guess I'll just say most artists and sort of exclude myself. I do think it's something that most artists have to deal with at some point. They get competent enough that they can't quite reproduce what they did when they were younger. And they have to figure out either new ways to get at the same thing, or have to figure out how to be successful and competent at the same time, which is very difficult. So yeah, I think that's those impeti are where the repetition especially come from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a question that I wanted to ask you, last night too. That's I know that your talk is mostly about prosody, but since you were talking also about your fairly close reading of the Bible, that opens up a question I'm interested in, that your work is often talked about in terms of race, But it seems to me that religion is as much a major feature of your poetry. You're the editor the poetry editor of Image Journal, which publishes writing informed by or grappling with religious faith. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing you talk just a little bit about the role of poetry in your religious faith or vice versa, and maybe how your religious faith intersects with your thinking about race.
I thank you for that question. I really like one of the things I love about the questions that are being asked is they assume that I think, and that's nice of people. And I definitely want to live up to that. I don't know. Let's see what I can say about that. Okay, so how do poetry and religion intersect for me? I guess in a sort of practical way. Stevens was always trying to figure out what he called the supreme fiction, like a paradox that I don't think you can really be comfortable in without something like actual religious faith. The kind of paradox you can't be comfortable with that actual religious faith, where he wanted to sort of generate this thing that would take the place of a God he could no longer believe in, that would allow his poetry to achieve the sorts of heights of poetry inspired by a more solid faith. I guess for me, God does, my religious faith does sort of do the thing that for me that Stevens maybe wanted the supreme fiction to do for him, insofar as one thing that's sort of wonderful about having a faith is a sort of deeply felt sense of the contingency of the world, which is if you believe in a universe sustained at every moment by an omnipotent being, then you believe in a universe in which at any moment the laws of the universe can be suspended and anything can happen. That there is no sort of stable instance in which you can rely on what we tend to think of as laws according to which the world and universe function. We can't rely on those to continue to be laws in the next second. It's useful for someone trying to write poems, I think, if you can stand it, to sort of keep your mind in that place where, I have a desk in front of me right now, but it might not be in front of me a second from now because it might just disappear, because anything's possible. And so if you can live in moments like that, if you can live with that kind of thinking, I think it allows access to the fantastic. And it does, even though I don't necessarily write a lot of fantastical poetry, it does remove certain kinds of limits to how you might imagine the world, that I suspect if you are not able to sort of access that kind of contingency, these are limits that you might not feel, but that would affect your work. And so for me, at least, my particular religious faith and art sort of interact in that way. I don't really think about religious faith, religion and race at all, which maybe is surprising, I don't know. It's just not a thing I think about much. I don't know that I have that kind of faith. One that, I'm constantly wrestling with faith, but I also have a faith that is maybe weird for people to understand, insofar as I don't have like doubts. Ironically, maybe not having doubts allows for a more intense kind of wrestling with one's thinking about God, etc. And so, but that also maybe doesn't, not really having doubts doesn't allow for certain kinds of questions, I suspect, although my sense of how this operates is not very highly developed. There were there's a couple questions that I don't want to lose in the Q&A. One by an anonymous attendee. But was there a second part of your question that I didn't answer, Suzanne? I can't.
No, I think that's great. And you know, we can definitely go back to the anonymous one that said your discussion of the fantastical, that your way of thinking about God opens onto, or the contingencies of our world, did make me think of, or take me to, in a way, what John Wilkinson's question here is about your trilogy. Well, I guess we can call it a trilogy, your epic poem, A Fire in Every World, where you take us into a purgatorial space, and there's a long hell poem, and your heaven poem, a sequence of lyric heaven poems that are full of fantastical material. And wildly imaginative, and have this kind of almost dreamlike, shimmering, visionary quality to a lot of the world building of those poems. And this question that John has typed out here is one that I wondered myself, reading these poems. At what point did you recognize that the Jim Limber poems would extend into a project, this epic project that exceeds a single book? Did it begin with a single poem that just came to you, or did you imagine them mapped out in advance in some way?
That's a good question. It began with a poem in the language of my captor, the poem in which Verena Davis encounters Jim Limber, or perhaps it's better to say Jim Limber encounters Verena Davis, sort of at the side of a road. Because someone on Twitter had kind of inadvertently alerted me to the existence of Jim Limber. And, you know, because there's a very particularly American anxiety about making the major statement, whenever I find any kind of subject, at that time, whenever I found any kind of subject, I was always sort of keen to see if I could make it into a big thing. The poem itself was a sonnet, but I thought maybe I could write more sonnets. And I was surprised to discover that I could write more sonnets. And so I ended up writing the Jim Limber poems, and just that whole sequence in the language of my captor. And by the time that I had finished that, I had already started writing the hell poem before I wrote it in the language of my captor. But eventually, I guess actually I should say, when I was finishing the hell poem, I kind of realized that I had purgatory, I had hell. I should write a heaven poem. I'd already done the Jim Limber poems. And I didn't really even think about, you know, putting Limber in heaven. It was just sort of a thing that happened. Because I thought that the Jim Limber perspective was one that I could utilize more. I wanted to write more poems from that imagined perspective. And I had sort of exhausted what I knew about Jim Limber's life in Captor. And so I could put Jim Limber in heaven with this caveat, which is not really explicitly expressed in Sometimes I Never Suffered, but in my next book, I have one poem about it. There's one more Jim Limber poem. The idea is that Jim Limber is in heaven, but it's heaven in a multiverse. And so there are also multiple heavens, and each speaker, although again, it's not exactly clear, each speaker of each Jim Limber poem, each Limber is a different one from a different universe. They're very similar to each other in some instances.
I think you might have frozen.
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, my computer screen is saying my internet connection is unstable. Anyway, because Jim Limber was in a multiverse, I thought that it would give me a lot of freedom. But there wasn't any particular moment when I realized it was going to be multiple books, other than when I started thinking about writing poems about heaven, and I thought, will people think this is like opportunistic or whatever, because the language of my Catholic books seemed to do relatively okay in the poetry world. I didn't want people to think that I was just sort of cashing in, whatever that would mean for poetry. But it really did feel like there was more to say. I think that particular line is exhausted now. As I said, there's one more Limber poem in the next book, but it's possible that the Hail poem line, those poems, there's going to be more of those, because there's a group of those in the next book, and I have some other ones still sort of floating around.
A group of Hell poems, did you say?
Extensions of the Hell poem. Yeah, because they're all designated as sort of like non-canonical alternate versions or alternate extensions, because the version of the Hell poem that's in the Gilded Auction Block is sort of the definitive version, but then I imagine other endings, other extensions, further versions.
Yeah. Well, there are. You've got you call them variations on Jim Limber in Heaven. So I guess that opens that up. And that book has a really interesting structure where you open with section 1 and then followed by section 2, and then you have a poem in the middle that's Jim Limber in limbo, and then you go back to section 2, and then you go back to a section 1. Can you give us just like, I mean, we're running out of time here, but I was very interested by that structure and curious what you might have to say about how you came up with that.
Sure. Let me answer that so quickly as I can, and then I want to answer anonymous attendees.
Yeah, there's a question about line and line break too.
Why that structure? Because Limber is in a multiverse. I thought that having this sort of mirror structure would afford me the possibility of kind of having two versions of an overall story arc, even though it's not the same character in two poems. Nonetheless, you can follow a kind of narrative from Limber to Limber through the first section 2, and then a different narrative from the second section 2, because the first section 2 ends with that very short verse drama, and I consider that to be a bad ending. It's a bummer what Limber decides to do. But then in the second version of the story, I think it ends in a I guess, for lack of a better word, happier way, with Limber sort of recognizing sort of the possibilities available to him in his situation. He's had a kind of long argument with heaven, and at the end of it, I think he's coming to peace with where he is. And so, yeah, the structure allowed me to sort of double back. It's sort of an ultimate kind of repetition, allowed me to say things twice, or, have an ending to a story that wasn't the absolute ending, and I could redo it. So the anonymous attendee, I can just read it out. They said, "You've inspired me to pay more attention to meter in my own work, though I've historically prioritized the line break to optimize each line's entityness, music, and textual, subtextual effects across successive lines. My fear is that prioritizing meter will have me break my lines or alter the line's language such that I'd lose the effects I would otherwise privilege. How would you advise a poet to attend to meter without compromising other effects that non-metrical free verse seems to allow?" I think you're partially answering this question now, but I've been multitasking to get this question. So my answer is terrible. It is practice. It is sort of hard to believe, at least is for me, but the nightmare of competence that I mentioned earlier, I have gotten to a point where even though I do write meter, I no longer feel like my lines are controlling me. And you always need to be open to what the poem is telling you to do. I never know what I want to write about ahead of time. I always find that out as I go along. That's the sort of our Wordsworthian inheritance. And so I think that's terribly important. But at the same time, the better you get at controlling your meter, about figuring out, how to use meter, the less often you will find a line that, in order to satisfy meter, dispenses with other effects that you wanted to achieve. The more you work at it, the more you will be able to have it all at once. And so it's really honestly really just is practice. Just work at it, and you will find yourself not having to make those sorts of compromises.
Great. Yeah, 10,000 hours. I think we're supposed to apply to our craft before we get
That's
anywhere.
what people say. Sure.
Well, thank you so much. I think we should probably wrap things up. We're hitting about the hour mark here, and you've been incredibly generous with your time and your thoughtful answers. I wish we could all loiter in the hall and chat and approach you with further questions, but
Sure.
Sadly, we're gonna just disperse to the winds. So I guess that's it. I'm sorry we don't get to fetch you in person, but
Yeah, me
hopefully
too.
we'll have you
I'm
back
sorry.
here sometime when we can actually meet.
I hope so. And I'm sorry, I don't know why have been weirdly blurry for a while. At least to me, I am weirdly blurry. I assume
You're a
I'm
bit
weirdly blurry to all of you.
blurry, yeah.
And I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry about that. But I thank you all for coming, and thank you, Suzanne and Starsha, for making this work.
Well, I guess we'll sign off now. Goodbye, everyone. Have a
Bye.
great
Thank
afternoon.
you.
Thank you all. Bye.